Okay, hello. I'm Professor Pete Burnap from Cardiff University. I'll be introducing and talking through the CyBOK risk management and governance knowledge area today. So, brief introduction to the knowledge area. The knowledge area covers, to start with, some of the fundamental principles of cyber risk assessment management and their role in risk governance, really explaining the various terminology around this, explaining why, as people, we need effective risk assessment and management principles to be able to capture and communicate factors that may impact our goals, our objectives, or our values. Describe different perspectives on cyber risk management, from an individual asset risk, components, devices, and so on, to whole system goals and objectives, maybe potentially very complex system level, supply chain level, and really study some of the major risk assessment methods and highlight their uses and limitations. We'll discuss security metrics, what features to measure for risk, how to measure them, why measure risk at all, and explain how and why effective governance is necessary to uphold cybersecurity, focusing in quite some detail really on the social and cultural factors, as well as the technical factors that are essential to consider for developing governance frameworks. Finally, we'll discuss incident response and its link to the risk governance process. So what is risk? Risk is quite a tricky thing to define. It's defined in a number of different ways. The definition we've used in the CyBOK KA is really quite an abstract definition. It's based on Wren's definition, a working definition, which is the possibility that human actions or events lead to consequences that have an impact on what humans value. So the key point there, I suppose, is that it's grounded in human values, which can apply to a range of different scenarios and really focuses on, individual risk up to collective, organizational risk at large scale. And the variety of things that humans value in that, and in fact the different things that humans value within that, from a personal level and from an organizational level. We'll talk about how to define risk and capture indicators to measure and manage risk. Again, the sort of general areas of consideration here are outcomes that have the impact on what humans value, the possibility of those occurring, which captures to a degree the level of uncertainty we have, and then some sort of formulaic approach to combine both elements. So these elements are the core of most risk assessment methods. So a key challenge with risk is making our assumptions explicit, not ideally keeping them to ourselves and assuming that everyone else understands. And also finding the balance between what are effectively subjective risk perceptions, and we'll go into detail on what that means, and objective evidence. So risk assessment is basically the process of collating observations, perceptions of the world, where we can justify logical reasoning or comparing, actual outcomes with our perceived understanding of risk. Risk management is then the process of developing and evaluating the options available to deal with this and handle risk in a manner that is agreeable to anyone who could be impacted. And again, that's often a wide variety of people. We need to consider the spectrum of basically no, that's absolutely not acceptable at all, to yeah, that's fine, and everything in between. And then risk governance is the overarching set of ongoing processes, principles that really aim to try and ensure awareness of all the risks and the things in place to manage them, educating people involved in the risk management process and within the systems for which the risk is being managed, the responsibility and the accountability of all involved in managing risk. So those are some key definitions for risk assessment, risk management, and risk governance. So why is this important? So ultimately, risk assessment has three core elements, as we alluded to earlier: identification and, if possible, estimation of hazards. So these are identify possible events that may affect our values and the strength of that outcome. Then moving on to the assessment of the exposure, which is understanding the aspects open to threat. So this is very broad, it can be people, devices, databases, and the vulnerability. So these are the attributes of the aspects that could be targeted. So for example, with people, a susceptibility to deception; for devices, potential hardware flaws; databases, potential software exploits; and the estimation of that risk, combining the likelihood and the severity, which is the impact of the outcomes. And this varies in how this is done. Can range from extremely quantitative with very detailed numbers to very qualitative and subjective labels. Without any of this, so we don't have any basis for which to understand our exposure to threats or devise a plan to manage them. So while it is complex and sometimes difficult to pin down all the specific details, these core components essentially give us a framework to start from. So the range, I suppose, of options in risk management or risk assessment, you can have anything from something that's extremely intolerable, which is basically this has to be abandoned. We can't do this within the system because it's intolerable and we can't move forward. There are various principles that allow us to deal with tolerable risks, trying to reduce the risks to as low as reasonably possible or as low as reasonably allowable. We see quite often in safety critical systems. And you might have a range of options there. You might mitigate risk, share it with others, transfer it to somebody else. It's essentially trying to manage that risk to allow the system to proceed, but in a tolerable way. And then, of course, there's risk that is acceptable. Risk reduction is not necessary. We can proceed without intervention. And, of course, there are risk opportunities. So there is an upside often to risk. So the outcome may be to accept it and embrace the risk rather than to reduce it. And you can read some more about that in the reference there in Hilson's work. So deciding, which to select is going to vary between different individuals, different organizations, and will depend on a number of factors. There's some advice on this in the various standards, ISO 31000 being a good one. It's really based around the consequences of the risk realization, the appetite for risk, the organizational capacity to handle risk. Small companies, for example, perhaps don't have the same amount of resource to be able to manage risks, so they have to take slightly more risks. But again, that comes down to the appetite of the people in charge of the organization and the people operating the organization. So REN also defines 4 types of risks that require different management strategies. So there's routine risks, so pretty much a normal decision making, statistics, relevant data, understanding desirable outcomes and limits of acceptability. Risk reduction measures are put in place, so car accident safety devices are examples of these. There are complex risks where they're less clear-cut. There needs to be a broader set of evidence to understand these risks, and maybe running things like cost-benefit analysis or cost-effectiveness. Drug treatment effects and things like climate change are examples of this, much more complex and less clear-cut. There are uncertain risks where there's a lack of predictability. Essentially, going into this, you need to take a more of a precautionary approach. Try and deal with, continually observing the system, managing it, and enabling negative side effects to be sort of contained and rolled back. So here we're dealing with very uncertain outcomes, not necessarily particularly easy to put processes in place around it. So the processes need to be some way of being able to manage reversal of outcomes and problematic effects. Finally, ambiguous risks. So where we've got stakeholders, organizational staff, civil society interpreting risks differently. So different viewpoints or a general lack of agreement in the public, or areas where there's potential for different views. So there's examples of this, such as GM foods, where we need to really make the whole discussion around risk much more participatory. Discursive measures need to be put in place to be able to understand various perceptions and put forward different manageable options. that can continue to be further evaluated over time. So, to summarize, the management options include a risk-based management approach where you've got risk-benefit analysis, comparative options, a resilience-based approach where you try and reduce the risk as much as possible, and a discourse-based approach where you've got continual communication, constant conflict resolution, and dealing with ambiguities. Again, without effective consideration of the acceptability of risk and an appropriate plan, it's likely that the response to the outcomes is going to be disorganized, ineffective, and probably lead to further desirable outcomes. So the importance of risk assessment is crucial here to ensure that doesn't happen. So another reason why effective risk management through a structured method is important, because although our working definition of risk is grounded in the consequences of interest to people, our values essentially, we're not as a society particularly good at assessing risk. So Slovich's work, seminal work on risk perception highlights that there's different types of perception of risk. So dread risk is one of the different types, which an example is based around nuclear accidents, which are ranked highest by lay people, to general society, but much lower by domain experts who actually understand evidence relating to safety limitations and controls for these systems. So experts tend to rank risks and threats based on expected and undesirable outcomes. So there's a general expectation that because of the processes and principles in place that deaths are actually quite low, and therefore that will be ranked quite low on the risk scale, whereas lay people are influenced more by their intuitive judgment. So a nuclear accident could essentially wipe out my whole community, my whole family, and have longer term risks because of the previous the exposure to their understanding of what a nuclear accident looks like. So there's essentially a mismatch between perceived and actual risks, and this is quite important, because as people we tend to exaggerate dread-related risks, and which are generally quite rare, such as nuclear incidents, terrorist attacks, and so on. But we downplay common ones like street crime and accidents in the home, even though the latter actually injure far more people. So there's this balance to play between evidence and real risk versus perceived risks. So this is also why concern assessment is important in risk management alongside risk assessment. So Schneer's book, Beyond Fear, notes that we as people, we have a natural sense of safety in our own environment and a heightened sense outside of this. So we feel safe walking down the street next to our house, but on edge when arriving in a new place. But we rarely study the statistics in making these decisions. They're based on our perceptions and our exposure to threat and our perceived control over our own safety or our own risk mitigation in this circumstance and our possible impact. So risk assessment helps us capture quantitative aspects of the world around us that enables us to put a realistic estimate on how certain we can be that adverse events will come to pass and how they'll impact on us. This applies to us then as individuals, as groups of people with a common aim. So saving the planet, running a business, educating children. We need to capture the goals and understand what could realistically lead to the failure of them being achieved, and put processes placed to reduce harms that could likely inflict some sort of impact on our objectives. So hence why this is very much grounded in human factors and culture. This is very much about understanding how people work as well as how technology might work to mitigate risk. So when it's done well, risk assessment and management enables decision makers responsible for risk to ensure that everybody involved in the system, operators and risk managers and day-to-day staff, can achieve the desired goals defined by the system stakeholders, and ensure the system is not manipulated either intentionally or unintentionally to produce some sort of undesired outcomes, as well as having some sort of process in place or a variety of processes in place to manage the impact should those undesirable outcomes occur. Risk assessment and management is also about presenting this information in a transparent, understandable, and easily interpretable way to different people. Different audiences who understand different ways of presenting risk in different ways. So, understanding the awareness of how they're being managed, who's responsible for managing them, Having that level of agreement is really important to get across to different audiences. If the risks aren't presented clearly to decision makers, either social, technical, economic, or whatever other types of risks, then the impact of the managing will be overlooked and the system will remain exposed. So essentially, having the processes in place is not enough. That needs to be communicated to everybody involved. Likewise, if the purpose of the whole risk management process isn't made clear to people at the operational level, alongside their own responsibilities and understanding their accountability for risk impacts, then they're not going to buy into the risk management plan and the system will remain exposed. On a more broad level, for things like the nuclear example and the GM example, if the wider stakeholders or civil society are not heard, then there's a lack of confidence in the risk management plan, and there could also be a widespread rejection of planned system being proposed, which is, again, very important when it comes to cyber and the evolution of cyber systems and new types of approaches to digital in the everyday. There needs to be a very clear understanding of stakeholder concerns and a strong confidence in the risk management plan. As important as it is to convey these risks, it's also important to stress equally that they can't always be removed. There's likely to be some residual risk to things that we value. So we need to make these clear. Discussions need to be held to make sure that everybody's clear on that, involved in the operations and who is impacted, in fact, by the system. So ultimately, the decision makers have to make these decisions. They'll be held to account for the failure to manage risk, and they'll have to decide whether it's accepted, avoided, mitigated, shared, etc. But it's possible that that wider stakeholder group, particularly those involved with system operations, may have a different view on how to manage the risk. They're likely to have different values that they're trying to protect. So for some people, saving money will be key. For others, reputation is the main focus. For people working with the system day to day, they just want to get the job done. It's about process and carrying out daily tasks. So we've got to communicate these values again across all different stakeholders and ensure decisions are taken to minimize the risk are agreed, and they're agreed in line with the values of everybody involved with managing them, so that we can maximize the buy-in to that risk management process. Essentially, enforcing a risk management process is not likely to work where people don't buy into it. The risk management process also needs to explain why and how this links to other stakeholder involvement and capture everybody's values within this to make sure that they're bought into the risk management processes. So one of the major drivers for risk assessment and management can be to demonstrate compliance. So this could be maybe to have an audited compliance approval from an international standards body. It might be to comply with legal regulated demands. So in Europe, we've got the NIS directive that mandates that where people who operate in essential services such as critical infrastructure need to follow a particular set of principles. Or it could be to involve the marketability of the company through perceived improvements in public trust. One of the issues with this is it can sometimes lead to a tick box risk assessment where the outcome's less focused on managing risk and it's more about achieving the compliance. This can obviously then lead to a false sense of security and leave the organization exposed, which brings us back to the working definition of risk in terms of how it relates to human values. These examples focus on managing risk of failing compliance with various policy positions, and as a result might neglect the broader focus on impact on values held by the wider organizational, societal, economic stakeholders. The context and scope of the risk assessment has to take into account the broader outcomes in view to be useful at all and improve preparedness and resilience. So it needs to be an actual operational, day-to-day integrated process as opposed to something done for particular compliance purposes. So based on all these factors, it's quite clear that the risk assessment and management is absolutely a process, not a product. It's not something that you can necessarily just buy off the shelf. It's something that when you do it properly and do it well, it can significantly improve the organizational resilience. But when done badly or not at all, can lead to confusion, potential reputational damage, and of course, major impact on system functionality. It's sometimes perceived to be unimportant before you need it, but then once something happens in a time of crisis, all of a sudden it becomes critical. So throughout the process of risk assessment, we have to be aware that perception varies, a variety of factors vary, the risk itself and the exposure varies, and that despite objective evidence, it's not going to change. So the introductory sections have, I suppose, made the case for risk assessment and management more generally. The main focus is to, in this particular document, is to frame it around management of risk. So, as I mentioned earlier, technology is evolving. Digital technology is becoming pervasive and underpinning, pretty much everything that we do now. The growth of IoT is a good example here. With numbers expecting to reach silly numbers like 50 billion by 2022. Furthermore, human-based decisions such as driving, decision-making, potentially going to become replaced by automated technologies. Digital infrastructures that we become increasingly reliant upon can be disrupted massively, very quickly and indiscriminately as a result of, for example, ransomware. So the recent WannaCry attack showed how that spread to the UK NHS, causing £92 million of disruption, but something along the lines of 16,000 cancelled appointments. So the more we become dependent on cyber processes, the more we need to make sure that risk assessment and management is applied in the cyber context. It's absolutely a fundamental. Special cases have called it in this, that everyone is living and working with the digital domain and should understand and participate in and understand that cyber systems are going to underpin their values at some point in their day on most days, and therefore need to be brought into that risk assessment and management process. So risk governance then. So risk assessment and developing mitigation principles is only likely to be effective where there's a coordinated and well communicated and structured governance policy put in place. So there's three governance models put forward that we've used from Millstone's work. Technocratic, which is very much derived by science and evidence from domain expertise. Something a little bit more decisionistic, where they're developed with incorporating social and economic drivers, and then something that's a bit more inclusive and transparent, where risk assessment's considered from the outset with input from all these other things, and develops a model of sort of pre-assessment that includes views of the wider stakeholders that shape risk assessment and subsequent management policy. A little bit more inclusive, I suppose, from the start in that one, in considering those views in that more iterative, cyclical way. None of them are right or wrong. There's a fine balance to play here between bringing in scientific experts and perceptions of the layperson. The technocratic approach might seem logical to risk owners because it's based around evidence and science and reasoning. It's crucial to ensure, and again, it comes back to the cyber aspect, that risk assessment includes the wider stakeholder view. If we're moving towards a more integrated and pervasive cyber society, that we need to make sure that we include those wider stakeholder views. There's some work again by Rawman and Wren that identify 4 elements that influence perception of risk. So intuitive judgment associated with probabilities and damages, not necessarily based around science. Contextual factors surrounding perceived characteristics of risks, so how familiar people are and how much personal control they have. The nuclear example is a very good example of this. People aren't very particularly familiar with the technology that underpins it. They are familiar with the impacts of when it goes wrong, and they have no control over it themselves. Semantic associations linked to the risk source, so people associated with the risk and circumstances of the situation, and of course the trust and credibility of actors involved in the risk debate. Again, this is particularly important for technology. We see more and more technology exposures of where cyber risk management goes wrong or wasn't put in place effectively, which then impacts the trust and credibility of the technology developers, which then can lead to potential lack of engagement and adoption of future cyber technologies. So these are not particularly scientific. These different areas that shape perceptions, they're not particularly structured or evidence-based, but as Fishoff notes, defining probabilities are counted by the strength of belief that people have in the likelihood of an undesirable impact on their own value. So ultimately, you can give people all the science in the world, but actually, if the perception is stronger than that, then they're likely to reject the concept. So from a governance perspective, the more inclusive and transparent the policy development is, the more likely you're going to get support and buy-in from the wider stakeholder group, including lay people and operational staff, the people you need to be working in a secure way to make sure the risk assessment and management process is upheld. So a major principle with this governance activity is to make sure that whatever processes are devised and put in place, they're as tightly coupled with everyday activity and decision making as possible. Essentially, takeaway message being to make cyber risk as important as health and safety, financial processes, and HR processes now are. It's very unusual that we would try and do anything that would put health and safety at jeopardy. We're very aware of financial processes and HR processes when it comes to recruitment and so on. They're part of our everyday thinking. It's very unusual now to work outside of those processes. So we need to get cyber as a process within that and get people thinking and understanding that the cyber risk assessment management process, or whatever that is termed, is as important as these other processes that we now consider. So essentially, cybersecurity should be thought of as a clear set of processes that reduce the risk of harm to individuals, to the businesses, and so on. And everybody involved in the system has to understand that, and it must be part of the operational culture. The risk government approach then is therefore key to that cultural adoption, and unless we get the cultural adoption right, we're never going to get the risk assessment and management processes tightly integrated. So that brings us nicely onto the human factor and risk communication. So work by Sasha and Flesher identified that human actors can impact security governance, and essentially identify some areas where people are impacted. So having problems using security tools correctly, not understanding the importance of data, software, and systems for their organization, not believing that the assets are actually at risk at all, that they would even be attacked, or indeed not understanding that their behavior puts the system at risk. So again, this highlights that risk can't be mitigated with technology on its own. You have to consider concerns and the wider views. If risk perception is widely held that they don't believe their assets are going to be attacked, then despite statistics showing security breaches are rising year on year, it's likely that the problem is within the cybersecurity culture of the organization. These human factors still exist and are not being addressed. Possibly technology is being used as the solution, but it's still not solving the problem. So educating people within the organization is therefore vital to ensure cultural adoption of the principles and make sure that the principles defined in the management plan are adopted. People are generally going to do what they need to do to get the job done. They'll follow the path of least resistance or highest reward. And again, as this research pointed out, people fail to follow security behavior for one of two reasons. They're unable to behave as required. So it's not technically possible to do so, for example, or another example being the security procedures and policies are difficult to digest, unclear, a bit impractical, or that they don't want to behave in that way. So an example of this is they find it easier to work around the proposed low risk theme, but find it time consuming, or that they disagree with it entirely. Again, this comes back to the understanding that it's going to impact on their own values. So VREX and SASE studied compliance with password rules and as an example of a security policy, and found that lack of compliance was people not believing that they were personally at risk or that they'd be held accountable for the failure to follow these rules. So there's a need to ensure a sense of responsibility and accountability as well should there be a breach of policy. There has to, of course, be mindful of legal and ethical implications as well as the cultural issues, which it's a balancing act. But if people aren't aware of responsibility and accountability, or don't feel that there is any responsibility or accountability, then again, it's unlikely that they're going to engage and be compliant with the processes that have been put in place. So risk communications obviously therefore got a massive role. These are just some examples. This is a non-exhaustive list, but so education, particularly around risk awareness and the day-to-day handling of risk, including risk assessment and management. Training and inducement of behavior change, so taking the awareness provided by education and changing internal practices, making sure that the processes are updated to adhere with security policy in everyday operations. Creation of confidence around organizational risk management, development of trust, maintaining this through performance and handling of risk. And involvement is a key one, particularly in the risk decision-making process, giving stakeholders an opportunity to take part in that risk and concern assessment, partake in conflict resolution. If we get involvement early in the development of the risk assessment management process and the governance model itself, then there's likely to be more buy-in to that, because the people involved in it and that need to use it on a day-to-day feel like they've had some input into the practicalities of it. And even if their proposals haven't been adopted, then at least they would have been heard, considered, and potentially explained as to why they can't be adopted or why we have to do things in a certain way. So just culture's an interesting aspect of this. So DECA's principles aim to balance accountability with learning. So the proposal is really to change the way in which we think about accountability, so that it's not about punishment as such. It's more about learning and improving the security posture. So one of the difficulties with reporting cyber breaches or problems with cybersecurity is that people might think they're at fault. But if accountability can be intrinsically linked to helping the organization without feeling stigmatized or penalized, then it's likely that people are going to be more engaged with the improvement process. There's often an issue with those responsible for security governance having a limited awareness of understanding of what it means to practice it in the operational world, which likely sometimes means it's impractical. So in these cases, we need to be aware that there's no right or wrong case, and that potentially the process that have been thought out and the practices put in place are likely to be the thing that potentially led to the security breach, as opposed to malicious human behavior. So if this is the case, this needs to be addressed, and the person at fault, in inverted commas, I suppose, in that case, needs to feel supported and free of anxiety. So we still now see a lot of public narrative in the news on this, where humans are played up as the weakest link, as it were. But I think reframing that and actually saying humans are doing a job using processes and principles that were put in place for them to do that job, if that isn't secure, then likely we really need to think about those processes and principles again, as opposed to just blaming the human and putting them immediately at fault. It's possible, of course, they could be at fault, but the principles of just culture are more around accountability for learning rather than punishment. So one suggestion DECA makes is to have a completely independent team to go through for security breaches, so they don't have to go through a line manager, for example. The idea being that people are aware of pathways and outcomes that follow security breaches that are not directly going to impact them through their line manager, whether that be maybe through perceptions or whatever else, that might reduce anxiety about what's going to happen and therefore lead to a more open security culture. So again, this is hard, this is difficult, it requires resource, it requires thinking through, it requires new processes. But when we think about perceptions and how people buy into security governance processes, these are important things to consider. So given that security awareness and education is such an important factor, Jack Riff's work links security awareness to metrics and a range of, I suppose, questions that we consider as useful pointers for improving security culture. So are employees acknowledging their security responsibilities as users of information systems? So new employees completing security awareness training. Are they receiving training at intervals consistent with the company policies, with a metric of our existing employees completing refreshers? Do security members possess sufficient skills and professional qualifications which you can measure? Are security staff acquiring new skills at a rate consistent with management objectives? Are security metrics and trained efforts leading to measurable results? So by business unit or office, correlation of, for example, password strength with time elapsed in training classes. You could do that by business unit or office, correlation of tailgating with training latency. The metrics, potentially are a crude way to capture adherence to security policy, but when linked to questions that are related to the initial risk assessment, they can provide an objective, measurable way to continually monitor and report on the security of a system and to decision makers, as well as those responsible for governance. It's worth noting, though, the complexity of metrics here, with the use of the term acknowledging, for example, in the first bullet point on the previous slide, doesn't necessarily mean that people will acknowledge their responsibility mainly by completing the awareness training. This reinforces the point again about human factors and security culture, and the following section we'll come to on enacting security policy. So training will go so far to make people aware, potentially, but then acknowledging their role in that is a different thing. So overall, effective cyber risk governance will be underpinned by a clear and enactable security policy. From the initial phase of the risk assessment, there should be a clear focus on the purpose and scope of risk assessment. During this phase, we might look at whole system security for more complex systems, focus on identifying objectives and goals of the system. These should be achievable with clear links from objectives to processes that underpin them. Risk needs to be clear statements that can capture the interdependencies between vulnerabilities. This is important. Causes and effects that comprise the risk. This is very difficult to do, particularly in complex systems, understanding the cause and effect within and between components and parts of that system. And risk management decisions need to be taken to mitigate the threats identified with processes linked to security policy, which have clear articulations of required actions, activities, and by whom, along with a clear timeline. This should also include what's expected to happen, of course, as a consequence of a risk becoming a reality. So presentation in this context is really important. We quite often see things like heat maps and matrices used to visualize risk, but there is some research that's identified limitations of this. So it's very important, essentially, to understand the purposes of how we're visualizing it and the accuracy of the evidence in doing so. So human factors, there's a lot more on this in the human factors CyBOK knowledge area document, and security culture are fundamental to this enactment of the security policy. But in relation to risk assessment and management, just to summarize that, essentially people are failing to follow security behavior because they're either unable to do so or they don't want to. A set of rules dictating how security management should operate will almost certainly fail unless necessary actions are seen as linked to the broader organization, as I discussed earlier, in the same way as HR and finance policy requires. And people need to be enabled to operate in a secure way, not be the subject of blame culture. Making security culture more reflective, reactive to issues, responding to the just culture agenda, and creating a policy of accountability and learning, and using mistakes to refine security policies, not just to blame and penalize people. Security policy should therefore be formal part of all people's continuing professional development and continual reinforced messaging, with principles of risk communication being a really important part of a frequent and tailored messaging to an audience. So extensive discussion of sort of these principles are particularly relevant. I don't go into them in detail in the document, but you can find it at the reference 29 there in the CyBOK doc. So the part of the final risk assessment and management outcomes should be this list of accepted risks, associated owners who have oversight for them, and the organizational goals and assets underpinning the processes at risk. And these individuals, therefore, should be tightly coupled to this document and the review activity, and should be clearly identifiable as responsible for risk management. So this moves us on to risk assessment and management principles. So the UK's NCSC guidance breaks down risk management into two areas. So component-driven risk assessment, which is really focused on technical components and threats and vulnerabilities they face, which is often referred to as bottom-up. And then system-driven risk management, which analyzes the system as a whole, often known as top-down. The major difference between them is that the component-driven approaches tend to focus on specific risks to an individual component, hardware, software, data, staff, while system approaches try to focus more on the goals of the entire system, focusing on the higher-level purpose and subsequent impact of subsystems and how the various parts interact. So there's some work by Rasmussen which allows us to consider a hierarchy of abstraction for this. Goals and purposes being at the higher level, a focus on dependencies being sub-goals, and it's important to consider this in design. The issue is if these are omitted early on, then we need to retrofit security in a system that's already been deployed. Then at the lower levels, there's more of a functionality on a focus on functionality needed to achieve these overarching goals. So this diagram from Rasmussen's hierarchy is particularly useful for capturing this. So you've got the difference really of conceptual stuff at the higher level, system-driven, more about functionality, abstract purpose, and general function. When it comes down to real, if you like, you're looking at more physical function, physical form, components, devices, capabilities, equipment, and so on. Obviously, they're linked, but the complexity involved potentially at the system level and enables us to actually capture interdependencies and how failure of different physical functions and form will have an impact on the overall general purpose. So finding a balance between the two is key. So subsystem approaches can help better understand that kind of those interdependencies. Remember that this isn't just about technology. This can include people, technology, organizational processes, even things like regulation and politics. Taking such an approach, which might be more research intensive, is only really necessary where complexity actually exists. If the interactions and dependencies in a system are quite clear, then, or less complex, for example, maybe a system, or small system office-based IT infrastructure, then component-driven systems probably fine. But if, for example, we're looking at a large nuclear power facility, for example, or a big, large manufacturing plant, then something that's more system level may be useful to consider the interplay between the various components involved in safety critical systems. So these discussions, essentially, how having that discussion process around the higher and lower level things are really essential to work out where you are with component level and system level and how to manage it. This may vary, but I think generally component risk is likely to be more important to operational employees who need the component to be functioning for it to be part of a bigger system that they work in. So staff, data, devices, things that are operational. Systems level risk is likely to be more important to higher level managers who've got sort of a vested interest in strategic direction or need to understand these complexities of something failing further down the value or supply chain and how that's going to impact on them. So the challenge again is perceptions and trying to work both of these into a representation of risk that can feed into a risk management and governance policy that can be enacted by all parties. So some definitions around risk. These are sort of widely used interchangeably, and these are the terms that I've sort of pinned down for this particular document. So a vulnerability is something that we'd say is open to attack and misuse that could lead to an undesirable outcome. If that vulnerability were exploited, it could lead to an undesirable impact on the process. So these could be diverse. So, for example, software interfaces being vulnerable to invalid input, people, businesses vulnerable to a lack of human resource, and legal databases being vulnerable or linked to large legal fines and so on. So those are vulnerabilities. A threat then is an individual event or an action that has a capability to exploit a vulnerability. So threats are also socio-technical and can include hackers, disgruntled employees, poorly trained employees, poorly designed software, poorly articulated and understood operational processes. So to give concrete examples of linking to vulnerabilities, so the software interface has a vulnerability in that malicious input could cause the software to behave in an undesirable manner, for example, delete tables from a database, while a threat then is an action or event that exploits the vulnerability, so the hacker that introduces the malicious input to the system. So there's a clear difference between those two. So then we got likelihood. Likelihood represents the measure capturing a degree of possibility that a threat will exploit a vulnerability. So therefore lead to that undesirable outcome. This can be a qualitative indicator, low, medium, high, quantitative value, 1 to 10 percentage. Again, these vary. And the impact then is the result of the threat exploiting the vulnerability, which has a negative impact on the success of the objectives for which we've assessed the risk. So from a systems view, this could be failure of manufacturing a new product on time, while from a component view, it might be failure of the specific manufacturing production component. So hopefully those make sense. It's quite important with risk assessment to use terms, even if they're used interchangeably, to be clear in what those definitions are. So, for example, describing a vulnerability as a threat often happens. It's important to make sure that the terminology is consistent, at least throughout the risk assessment. So the purpose of capturing these elements of risk is really for use in a dialogue that aims to best represent how to determine the exposure to cyber risk and how best to manage it. So the NIST guidance from the US captures vulnerabilities, threats, likelihood, impact inside multiple processes. So called prepare, which is the pre-assessment, conduct, which is the appraisal and characterization, communicate, and the maintain and management cycle. So there's a step-by-step in the full document, and the reference is obviously there, and you can find that in the knowledge area document. We'll summarize the actions, though, here. So prepare is basically involves identifying the purpose, establishing a baseline of risk or identifying vulnerabilities, threats, likelihood, and scope, which part of the systems or organization are likely to be included in the risk assessment, what decisions are the results informing, essentially. It also involves defining assumptions and constraints on the elements, such as resources required and predisposing conditions that need to inform the risk assessment. The assessment approach and tolerances are also defined, and sources of information relating to threats are also defined, vulnerabilities and impact. So conduct is the phase where threats, vulnerabilities, likelihood, and impact are identified. There's a range of ways this can be conducted, and this will vary again based on the nature of the system being assessed. NIST has a very specific set of tasks to be performed, but they may not be relevant to all systems, but there are some useful things in there, including things like identifying threat sources, adversary capability, intent and targets, the likelihood that threats will exploit vulnerabilities and the impacts, and so on. Again, it's tailoring these various aspects to what you need based on the prepare phase. Communicate is one of the most important phases and one of the most overlooked. So conducting a risk assessment gives one the data to be able to inform actions, but it's crucial that this is going to be communicated using an appropriate method. Executive boards will expect information to be presented in a very different way to operational team members, and general organization staff will need educating and guiding in an entirely different way. Again, this comes back to the previous principles. The results and evidence of risk assessment have to be communicated in a manner accessible to each stakeholder in a way that's likely to engage them in the proper execution of the risk management process. Finally, maintain is an ongoing phase, keeping the risk assessment up to date in light of changes in the environment and configuration. So security postures change all the time. Again, this is particularly important for cyber. So IoT, the number of IoT units installed from 2014 to 2020 saw an increase of 2.63 million units across the business sector. So by this year, it's supposed to project to 3.39 million. So this rapid integration of devices into corporate IT or any other type of IT for that matter is likely to change the exposure to risk, because the IoT devices come with their own risks. So the scope would need to be refined, new risk assessments carried out, and actions need to be communicated to all stakeholders to ensure that the inclusion of this new technology is managed. So this scenario indicates that risk assessment maintenance must be proactive, undertaken much more regularly than on an annual basis, certainly not considered purely for the purposes of compliance, and essentially, if you just do it once a year for compliance purposes, it's likely to leave the organization exposed to new technological threats, particularly new cyber technologies evolving in this way. So this is a nice diagram here that really captures how they all hang together, with the prepare phase coming first, the conduct phase having the various identification of threats, vulnerabilities, likelihoods, magnitude, which feeds the communication, and the maintain. One important thing to note here is that in this flow, it says to identify the threats and sources of events before the vulnerabilities. One issue to consider with that is we might not always know what all the vulnerabilities are. So we need to be aware that there may be vulnerabilities in our system that we're actually unaware of. So therefore, we can't identify threat sources for. So we need to be cognizant of that, and again, need to be proactive and have the process in place to deal with those instances. So there's a number of risk assessment and management methods. For the purposes of time, I'm not going to go through all of them, but what I've done is present a reasonably complete list and comparison of component and system level risk assessment methods in the CyBOK Risk Management and Governance KA on pages 18 to 22. There's some nice tables in there that aim to capture some of the key strengths and reasons why you might pick any one of those. So I would suggest before undertaking a practical risk assessment, to go through those and have a think about what suits you best. They'll vary for different people. So a note on cyber physical systems. So traditional IT, so corporate desktop computers, devices and servers, they generally take a risk assessment perspective based around minimizing access generally called confidentiality, modification of data, called integrity, and downtime, so availability, the CIA triad. The world of cyber physical systems typically has a great focus on safety. So these components are known as sometimes industry control systems, and they underpin critical national infrastructure. These are the things that keep the lights on: energy provision, transportation, water treatment. They also underpin complex manufacturing systems. So operational technology risks will often involve more of a safety and reliability context due to the nature of failure impacting potentially worker and general public safety and livelihood, and having a direct impact on the physical world. So this is perhaps a primary case for systems-driven methods over component-driven methods, because of the abstraction away from the components and thinking more about avoiding death, complying with regulation, ensuring the key continuity of service of critical national infrastructure. And taking this view can bridge the security and safety perspective on how best to mitigate risk with shared system-level objectives in mind. So another aspect of this is efforts to continually monitor and control operational technology remotely have led to the convergence of operational technology with more traditional IT, linking the business and that's associated risk to safety critical systems. So technology such as SCADA provides this capability to continually monitor and control operational technology, but that's got to be suitably defined to prevent risks from IT impacting OT. So I mentioned earlier the NIS directive in Europe mandates that CNI operators are focused on impact and based their risk assessment around these 14 goal-oriented principles. So safety critical systems have a history of significant global impact when failure occurs. Think of around the nuclear perspective. And the connectivity of this environment has the potential to increase the threat service. So bringing IT potentially into OT with SCADA introduces additional risk elements, and we've seen recent OT attacks potentially linked to global politics and highly resourced attackers as well, where there's nation states at play in affecting these systems. So really critically important to ensure consideration of the systems level view and the exposure to risk there. So yeah, we don't really go into too much detail on cyber physical systems because that has its own CyBOK knowledge area, cyber physical system security, but this is just for the purposes of highlighting the need to consider the type of risk assessment and management, particularly in terms of how IT links to OT in this context. Read the cyber physical system security CyBOK knowledge area for more detail on cyber physical systems. Security metrics is a long-standing area of contention within risk assessment. What to measure, why to measure it, and so on. It's often difficult to quantify with any confidence how secure an organization is. Qualitative representation such as low, medium, high, red, amber, green are quite often used in the absence of trusted quantitative data, but then there's often a concern that such values are subjective and they mean different things to different stakeholders. What does medium actually mean in terms of the impact on my own personal values versus another person's personal values? So open questions include what kind of features of a system should be measured, how to measure risk, or why measure it at all. Some metrics may be related to risk levels, some to system performance, and others used to link to service level agreements, provision, and reliability. Jacques again provides some more useful pointers on what's good and bad in terms of metrics. So these are just examples, and again, these all of the metrics area is quite subjective, but the key points are quite interesting. So need to be consistently measured to be good without subjective criteria. Cheap to gather, ideally in an automated way, again, which is quite difficult in a cyber profile. Expressed as a cardinal number or percentage, not with qualitative interpretive labels, high, low, medium, and high. Expressed at least one unit of measure. Contextually specific enough to decision makers so they can take an action. So if the response to a metric's like, so what, then it's not particularly worth gathering. So bad metrics examples are ones where they're inconsistently measured because they rely on subjective judgments from person to person, where they can't be gathered cheaply or is labor intensive. So you've got spreadsheets that nobody else can see, or they don't express numbers and units percentage, where they rely on quite subjective ratings, traffic lights and letter grades, for example. And this is quite contentious because these are used quite widely, red, amber, green. They are quite easily interpretable as this is really bad, this is medium, this is okay. But that in terms of metricizing something of meaning is quite difficult to relate to, particularly across different people. So Herman takes a more pragmatic view on risk based around return on investment. So the perspective on metrics there is grounded in understanding what we can't be completely secure. We know that. So measure actual security against necessary security. The metrics are tailored towards the effectiveness of vulnerability management. So is it possible to quantify whether risk assessment management plan and associated controls are fit for purpose based on threats identified? And do the metrics provide evidence that the controls are appropriate? Are the controls put in place likely to add more value and savings than they produce in the cost? So these are quite pragmatic and interesting ways of thinking about metrics also. So moving on to business continuity, ultimately, despite all the best efforts you put in place, it's likely that there is going to be some sort of breach at some point. As I mentioned earlier, it's not always possible to identify all vulnerabilities in advance. So an essential part of risk assessment management and governance includes consideration and planning of the processes to manage an incident and rapidly responding to that. So the aim is to understand the impact on the system, minimize it, develop and implement a remediation plan, and use this in understanding to improve defenses to essentially act as a feedback loop to avoid successful exploitation of vulnerabilities in future. So organizations typically prefer to keep the information about cyber breaches anonymous, largely due to reputational damage and cover-up lapses. But it's likely that other organizations, including competitors, are going to succumb to the same fate at some point, and it would be ideal to benefit from prior knowledge that the same incident has occurred. At a broad scale, it's something that needs to be addressed, really, especially given the offensive side of cybersecurity, communicate and collaborate all the time on how to exploit systems, opportunities and vulnerabilities for exploiting systems. Certain industries such as financial and pharma are quite well advanced with this. They've got quite good intelligence sharing platforms, but it's not really yet commonplace for all types of organizations. There's some large consortia such as the CDA and CISP and OASP. They're aiming to try and do this, I suppose, at a community level. So again, these are important things to consider in terms of maybe where your metrics come from, your interesting, useful information, intelligence comes from for your risk assessment. Not going to go too much into incident response because, again, there's the security operations and incident management CyBOK knowledge area, which I'd recommend reading. So some pointers, though, on business continuity. So there's the ISO 27035, which is the international standard that defines some principles for this, which expands on the 27005 model that we include in the discussions in the CyBOK KA document. So planning and preparing, including the definition of an incident management policy and a team to deal with it. Detecting and reporting, monitoring and reporting security incidents rapidly. Determine the presence and severity of an incident and taking decisive action on steps to handle it. Responding, which may include forensic analysis, patching, containment, and remediation of the incident, and then learning. A key part of the incident management is learning, making the improvements to the system defenses to reduce likelihood of future breaches. Again, capacity for this will vary across organizations in terms of resource. For example, it's unlikely that smaller business is going to be able to have a team to be able to deal with security incidents, but bearing in mind the supply chains are heavily dependent on SMEs, there needs to be some development in this area to ensure that there's better community resilience to attacks that involve all industries. So moving on to the conclusions, we've explained the fundamental concepts of risk, used the working definition of the possibility that human actions or events that may lead to consequences that have an impact on what humans value. We place this in the context of cyber risk and management and governance. We've looked at some of the academic foundations that have been widely adopted into national practice and explained links between the pre-assessment, context setting, risk and concern assessment, characterization, management and governance. We explained that risk governance is the overarching set of ongoing processes and principles that underpin the decision-making that encompasses both risk assessment and management and includes legal, social, organizational, and economic contexts. We've defined some core terminology as part of the structured processes, perceptions and evidence relating to what's at stake, the potential for undesirable events, the measurement and likely outcomes of impact, whether they be qualitative or quantitative. I think I made a major focus on the aspect of human perception and tolerance of risk. We framed these in the extant literature to argue their significance from risk governance, aligning with various types of risk: routine, complex, uncertain, ambiguous. We particularly focused on factors associated with the influence of perceptions of risk and discussed how these link to human factors and security culture. On that security culture point, we've made a point of that training, behavior change, creation of confidence, trust, and stakeholder involvement is crucial to the success of a risk governance policy. This is based on well-established literature that people's intuition and bias is going to outweigh any evidence presented to them about risk likelihood. And if they believe risk management is not trustworthy or doesn't apply to them or is beyond their control, then it's not likely to engage. We need people to buy into risk assessment rather than impose it upon them. So accordingly, we introduced a balance of accountability with learning, proposing that failures in risk government process should lead to feedback and improvement, where individuals that may have breached risk management policies should feel that they can bring it to the attention of their managers without fear of being stigmatized. We differentiate between system level risk that looks at the entire system and considered interdependencies between subsystems, and component level risk, which focuses on the risk to individual elements. As I said, there's a number of established risk assessment methods from systems and components perspectives that are analysed and tabulated in the CyBOK KA with core strengths and highlighted some of those. So what the core principles of risk, vulnerability, threat, impact exist across all methods. There are individual attributes that we've referred to as strengths in the document for each method that may make them a better fit for an organisation depending on the requirements of that organisation. Measuring security and the limitations of metrics were discussed in the context of possible options there, message risks. And finally, we looked at incident response and linked incident response and recovery to the risk management planning and governance process. Risk governance it's cyclical, it's iterative, it's not something that can be performed once. The cross-cutting aspects of communication, stakeholder engagement, and context bind the risk management and assessment processes are core to the reflection of the risk government process or practices. Again, this links to incidents when they occur. This has to inform risk management policy to improve cybersecurity in future, and we have to accept that ultimately we're not likely to ever be secure. So in line with this, human factors, security culture must respond to the ever-changing need to manage cyber risk, enabling and instilling continual professional development through education and just culture, where lessons can be learned and governance methods improved. Thank you very much. I hope you found that useful. That's it.